Welcome to the Live Life Well podcast for busy women with me, Joanne Bibby. I hope this is a place where you'll find encouragement, inspiration and community to live life well, body, mind and soul. Well, hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Live Life Well podcast with myself, Joanne Bibby. This is a place for busy women to come and find community and hopefully feel inspired to really take care of yourself, body, mind and soul as you take care of all those important people and things in your life. And today I couldn't be more excited to introduce to you my friend and neurodivergent coach, Sue. So Sue, I'm so delighted to have you on tonight. Can you please just introduce yourself, tell us who you are and what you do?
Hi, yes. Thanks, Joanne. It's lovely to be here. Yes, I'm Sue. I'm a coach with a long background in the public sector. I've always had an interest in building capacity and supporting people. But over the last few years, I've been coaching full time and discovered in the process of doing that, that I am a neurodivergent coach. I work with neurodiverse clients, but I'm neurodivergent myself. I have dyspraxia, and it has all sorts of impacts on my life. But I'm conscious I could end up rabbiting, Joanne. So, do you want me to say a bit about the different sorts of neurodiversity I work with, or would that be okay?
I think that'd be really helpful because this is quite a new topic to me, but I find it absolutely fascinating and I'm only just starting to learn about it. And I think it is something that does affect a lot of women, either directly or indirectly. So if you can give us a bit of that bigger picture of what is neurodivergency, what are the different kind of conditions people might come across, that'd be really helpful.
Lovely. Right. So what we're talking about, the global term that we're starting to use is neurodiversity. And what that describes is the sort of diversity amongst people's cognitive systems and ways of thinking about things and taking in information, as we see in other aspects of human society. So height, ethnic background, eye colour, build. You know, we're a very, very diverse race, and the diversity extends to the way our brains work. So that's neurodiversity. It's like any sort of diversity. People are different. Neurodivergent conditions are ones where you can assess and see a distinction in the way that somebody's cognitive function operates. It's a bit like having a slightly different operating system to the 80% of the population who are not neurodivergent. And it can come about in a number of ways, but my focus in coaching and a lot of the discussion in the sector is around those lifelong cognitive differences that can be measured and that quite often co-occur and often run in families. And the ones I'm talking about are autism or autism spectrum conditions, ADHD, attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, dyspraxia, which is my favorite because that's me, dyslexia, and there's a whole bunch of dyses. So there's dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and there's probably another one or two in there. And then tic disorders like Tourette's also falls under this heading. And you know, you mentioned women, Joe, and one of the reasons I'm so keen to talk about this stuff is that for donkey's years, girls and women have not been recognised as having those neurological conditions. The models that have been looked at to assess them have been based on what are considered the norms for boys and men. So we're gradually starting to realise that there are just as many girls and women affected, but it shows up in slightly different ways. One of the conditions people think they know a bit about is ADHD, and the stereotype of ADHD is a boy who's disruptive at school. Now, for girls and women, A, it doesn't always show up like that in boys and men. B, for girls and women, we're more likely to exhibit the inattentive side of ADHD, so being daydreamers, rather than being disruptive. And even if girls and women have got the hyperactivity element of ADHD, that may show up differently. So whereas a stereotypical boy might be regarded as being disruptive in the classroom, an ADHD girl may be the most helpful girl in the class, the one who's always volunteering to go and get this or do that or look after somebody. And it's still hyperactivity, but because it's not displayed as a bad behaviour, it's not regarded as a problem in the same way. For many, many years, it was assumed that women weren't autistic. Girls and women weren't autistic. Again, that was a male characteristic. And we're starting to realise that it does affect girls and women. And I'm seeing women who are realising in their 30s, 40s, or even beyond. I was 62 when I was assessed as being dyspraxic, who have successfully managed these conditions in a lot of ways, but perhaps never quite hit the heights that they're capable of, and have known that something's holding them back, but never been sure what. And it's only when their own children are picked up in school, maybe as being dyslexic or having ADHD, and somebody then says to mum, have you ever thought about whether this might be you as well? And then there's a bit of a light bulb moment. So I think there are a lot of women out there who are coping with I don't want to say the word deficit, it's a word I flipping hate, but the challenges of having a neurodiverse condition. They may be using their strengths beautifully to compensate for the challenges, but using a lot more energy than they should need to be doing to get where they want to be. Does that make sense?
Oh, completely. And I just love hearing your passion and your wisdom on this. I could literally talk to you for hours about this. And I think it's so great that we're doing this, because I know personally, I was quite shocked to realise that I possibly have a neurodivergent condition. I'm exploring an ADHD diagnosis, and I read somewhere recently that the average age for women to be diagnosed with ADHD now is 39, which I find really sad, but also really hopeful. I feel like we're talking about it more, people are more aware, and the relief that it's not just something wrong with you, that maybe there's an explanation for why your mind works the way it does. And so I think it's great that it's more in people's awareness. So you said you were 62, is that right? When you were...
I was 62, yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about your journey of coming to that point of diagnosis, how that felt, and then we can maybe go on to talk about how someone would go about exploring if they felt they might be neurodivergent, how they would start that journey.
Absolutely. Well, I'm dyspraxic, and just briefly, what that all the neurodiverse conditions have their own differences and particular characteristics. There's also a lot of overlap, and they tend to hang around in groups. So you will find in the same person or the same family, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD. It can be a very rich mix. And we're starting to wonder whether this is part of an overall spectrum, and seeing it less as, very separate conditions. Okay. The specifics about dyspraxia are that it affects our motor skills, and it can either be gross motor skills. So it can get picked up in school when children are having difficulty hitting coordination milestones, They may have difficulty telling right from left, or, you know, difficulty with ball skills, riding bikes, that sort of thing. It can hit the gross motor skills. It can also hit the fine motor skills, which is what I had. So my handwriting was always messy. I spill things, drop things, bump into things, but I can ride a bike, just about. I can drive a car if I'm careful, and I can catch a ball, as long as it's not a tennis ball and I've got to coordinate the bat as well. I know it's not a bat, it's a racket there. Anyway, so as I said, I'm in my 60s now. So both my brothers were picked up when they were young with what was then termed hand and eye coordination difficulties, and that picked up on these motor skills. It wasn't something that girls had, and my gross motor skills, so the bigger movements, were better than my brothers. So there was never any thought that this might be an issue for me. And then as life went on, I kept hearing little bits about dyspraxia and thinking, you know, I do bump into things, I do spill things, I can't copy, draw. Anyway, fast forward to my late 50s, early 60s, and I had a career change from being in the public sector to coaching. It was something I wanted to do, and I took advantage of having been made redundant from the public sector to completely retrain as a coach. And as luck would have it, the organisation I qualified with were doing a CPD event. There was a speaker there who was talking about coaching with neurodiverse clients, and it was the first time I'd heard the word. And she was actually talking about coaching with a company called Genius Within that I've done a lot of work for since. And I was really interested in this, to be frank, because I was looking for coaching work. Had an interview with them, started coaching with them, absolutely loved it, because it was a strengths-based approach, which is where I always tend to come from, and being very clear that people were the best experts on themselves. I'm never going to be the sort of coach that tells you what to do. You know, that's not coaching to me. But as I was working for them and learning more about neurodiversity, this question about dyspraxia started coming back in my head. And I had a client who was dyspraxic, and realized working with him that it wasn't just the physical coordination, it was things like time blindness, lack of organization, forgetting where he put things. And when I'd worked with him, I spoke to the occupational psychologists in Genius Within and said, you know, I really do wonder if this is me as well. I was very lucky because I was working with an organisation that not only coached around neurodiversity, but had specialist occupational psychologists who could assess the different aspects of neurodiversity. I was able to get a full occupational psychologist assessment, and sure enough, I'm dyspraxic. And I can't tell you the weight that came off my shoulders, because suddenly all the things that I'm so poor at and people see as being inattentive, a bit lazy, people who are well organized cannot understand why my desk looks like it does. Actually, anybody else neurodiverse goes, oh yeah, I get that. Unless they're one of my autistic friends who are really systems focused and have everything just as it needs to be. But it made a huge difference to me, and I've carried on in this area of work ever since. And the more I learn, the more I love it. You see how brilliant people are, because I've talked about the challenges, but somebody with dyspraxia like me, for example, as a strength, is likely to be very, very high scoring in terms of verbal comprehension and verbal reasoning. They will be problem solvers. They will have a strong sense of social justice, and all these things can be plotted on a cognitive profile. So yeah, that's my journey, is knowing that there was something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and not having the environment to explore that until I was in my 60s.
Well, it's so amazing that even though it took to that point in your life that you've been able to have that understanding of yourself, and that acceptance, I think, is a massive thing, isn't it? And I can see and I can feel myself, like the massive shame we can feel when we just can't, like, why can't I just do this better? Like, what's wrong with me? And it's almost like a process of grief and relief, isn't it? It's almost like that grief journey of like maybe anger and sadness, but then the relief and then the acceptance that comes, and then learning to live with yourself, with your brain that just works a bit differently. But I love like how you talk about being strength focused, and I think often we can focus on the negative sides of neurodivergent conditions, but actually there's massive strength and massive things to be celebrated as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and I mean, something like 35% of British entrepreneurs, and I don't mean, Richard Branson is dyslexic. I don't mean high-flying entrepreneurs. I mean people like you and me, Jo, who are individuals running their own businesses. 35% of people running their own businesses are neurodivergent that we know of, often dyslexic, often ADHD, because the strengths that come with those conditions are creativity, an ability to see the bigger picture, to find an alternative route around things. Places like GCHQ will now recruit specifically looking for those neurodivergent traits, because people with dyslexia may have trouble reading boring black on white text, but they spot patterns and they're the code breakers.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've lost my thread, but yes, the strengths-based approach is with so much talent. Yeah,
and I'm so glad that's been celebrated. Those positive sides are being celebrated. So you mentioned, as part of your journey, you just started noticing those little things, maybe hearing things, reading things. And that was kind of my journey too. I actually heard an article on Radio 2, Women's Hour, about a woman in her 30s being diagnosed after she had kids. That was the thing that sort of pushed her over the edge and realised she wasn't coping, that her brain didn't quite work the same as other people. Like the mess, the chaos was just overwhelming when her brain was really quite chaotic. So if someone's in that position, maybe hearing you chatting tonight, or maybe seeing stuff on social media and the press thinking, oh, I see myself in some of those things, where is a good place for them to start to explore, what conditions they might have, and where to get sort of advice and support with that?
A good place to start with all of the conditions are the national websites for the various conditions. So the ADHD Foundation, the British Dyslexia Association, the National Autistic Society, and they all acknowledge the crossover. So if you, particularly the ADHD one is really good on that. So the first thing to say is, if you have a suspicion about yourself, you know yourself better than anybody else, you're probably right. And if it helps you to look at support and tools for people with the condition you think you've got, go and access it. You don't need anybody's permission, and you don't need a doctor's letter to say, yes, I have ADHD, I need this support. Unfortunately, full diagnosis or assessment is very poor for adults. It is possible. I mentioned the occupational psychologist that I went to, and that is a route that can be pursued, but there are some really good screening tools, first of all on the national societies, and I'll send you the links, Joanne, and we can perhaps circulate those
we can share them in the bio for the podcast. That'd be great.
And then there are 2 self-screening tools that I recommend without any hesitation. One, which is free, and it doesn't give you a diagnosis, but it'll give you an idea of your strengths and challenges, is on the Genius Within website. And if you just Google Genius Within, it will come up. They will ask you for an email address, but you can do a screening. It won't attempt to diagnose you, that's not its purpose, but you'll know from it whether your profile actually is similar to somebody who has a neurodiverse condition, or more than one if you're really lucky. And the other really good site is the Do It Profiler, which was set up by Professor Amanda Kirby, and she's linked to Cardiff University. and she's got screeners for children and for adults, and she's now separated them into themed groups. There is a small charge for those, but what those do is give you a reliable, both of those give you a reliable, authoritative feedback on your own assessment of where your strengths and weaknesses are. There's no snake oil or badger milk involved in it, and neither of those organisations are going to come back to you and say, oh, we've noticed this about you, and for £2,000 we can do you a 4-day residential, and there's none of that. But what it will do is either reassure you that whatever's going on for you is unlikely to be that, or to confirm what you think you know about yourself. And you're then in a better position to decide whether you need a formal assessment or diagnosis, or whether just knowing that the probability is that you have those characteristics is enough for you to give yourself permission to get the support you need with the things that are challenges. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the way I think about that, Jo, I don't like talking about this in terms of disability, but in terms of the Equalities Act 2010, those neurodivergent conditions are invisible disabilities. They have a significant enough impact on our ability to live and thrive day to day for that to be considered an impact in the same way as somebody who has a physical or other or sensory disability. And if we can give ourselves permission to say, I'm not putting this on, I'm not an attention seeker, I'm not lazy, this is something I genuinely struggle with, I'm entitled to find ways of doing that better. If you or I had an accident, or for example, had really bad arthritis and ended up having to use sticks or a wheelchair, we would not beat ourselves up for not being able to reach something off a top shelf, would we? We would expect that things would be made accessible to us. And to me, it's exactly the same sort of issue. My brain works differently. There is no point asking me to do a fine line drawing or hit a tennis ball accurately. It doesn't matter how many times I practice. My spatial awareness and hand and eye coordination is never going to be good enough for that. You wouldn't ask a child with cerebral palsy to persevere and learn to play tennis well. And in my mind, it's exactly the same. There is a wiring component. Same with ADHD. There are things in the brain that can be seen in terms of levels of norepinephrine, I think it is, and dopamine that are specific to ADHD. And just do shut me up if I'm going on too long.
It's so good.
So for a lot of neurodivergency, and the occupational psychologists, wonderful, who assessed me, the first question they asked me was what difference it would make to get an assessment. What practical difference would that make in my life? Very little. But the one neurodivergent condition where there is a medical intervention that can make a difference for some people, or some of the time, is ADHD. So if you or anybody else feels that they may have ADHD and they may want to explore a medical route for addressing that, then you would need a formal clinical diagnosis, and that's something that can be done with a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So you get the strengths-based bit and the impacts bit, but the psychiatrist is somebody who can do the yes, this is definitely ADHD, and we can consider prescription if you want it. But there's virtually no adult pathway for that. So it's costly to do it individually. So unless you've got private health cover, or you work for an employer where they agree that there is an issue and and want to explore it, sometimes employers will help with that. The other thing that's probably worth saying, because they are all under the same umbrella, increasingly the interpretation I'm giving to the research and the evidence I'm seeing is that they're all aspects of a similar set of cognitive differences, and they are wired in. But because of the way these things have been dealt with historically, autism and Asperger's, and Asperger's is no longer given as a separate diagnosis, but there are a lot of people who have been diagnosed as having Asperger's and are happier with that label than describing themselves as autistic. Autism and including Asperger's and ADHD have been seen as mental health issues, and the diagnostic route has been through mental health services. And I'm going to stay away from saying what I think about that.
I can imagine.
Whereas dyspraxia, dyslexia, and Tourette's is sometimes shoved in that box as well. But dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, they've traditionally been seen as learning difficulties, and there's been more of an acceptance that they don't impinge on somebody's intellectual ability, that it is a process issue about learning to decode words or numbers. So the diagnosis routes have always been different, and it's I think traditionally been easier to get a diagnosis either at school or for a lot of young adults at university of dyslexia, dyspraxia. I think it's getting better with ADHD. But those things have been seen not as a behavioural issue, but as a process issue. Whereas it's autism and ADHD have been regarded as bad behaviour and have tended to be funneled down a mental health route.
Yeah.
And I won't go into that because I will explode if I do. But it means that even now, the ways of getting diagnoses for those things is different. It's easier to get an assessment for dyslexia, dyspraxia. It's easier. There's more of a mental health involvement for the others, and yet there's often a link between poor mental health and having ADHD or being autistic, largely because you're trying to live in a world that's made for you.
Yeah.
And it's the impact of the condition that causes the mental health issues. It's not, anyway, I'm not a clinician, and I'm going to try and stay out of territory that I don't belong in. But it just does mean that the routes can be different. Places like Genius Within and the national websites that I talked about to start with will all give good, reliable advice about where, if you want a formal assessment or diagnosis, you can go for that. But using those self-screening tools and quizzes on things like the reputable websites will give you an idea, because if you do have ADHD, or dyslexia, answering questions honestly will show you the differences. We've all heard of IQ tests, and if humans are measured on their cognitive abilities, there is a basket of agreed measures that are used, and it's everything from verbal capacity to organisation to can you picture things in 3D, all sorts of things. But there's a standard basket of measures, and as I understand it, all the self-tests are kind of based on those measures. Somebody who is neurotypical across that range, whether they are I'm trying to think of an alternative to highly, whether they are really bright and clever in traditional terms and all their scores are high, or they're somebody average and they're pootling around the average range, or somebody who has some very minor struggles with being independent. Their scores, wherever they sit on that spectrum of Mensa to to being okay, but only just, their scores will be fairly consistent right across that basket. In somebody who has a neurodivergent condition, what you will see is what we call a spiky profile. So the strengths will be really high, but the deficits or the challenges will score really low in comparison with the high scores, and may bring somebody whose strengths are right at the top of the intellectual ability, or the percentile scale for the population as a whole, but their challenges may fall so far below the average that that's where the challenge comes. And because the expectation we have of everybody is that everyone operates at their best, I think that's why some people get frustrated, and we get frustrated with ourselves. People don't understand why it is that you can be so clever and so bright and sharp in one area, and yet not even averagely competent in an area that they regard as basic. Does that make any sense?
No, massively. And again, it's going back to that whole idea of celebrating those things, isn't it? I think we can get so frustrated with the things we find challenging that we forget about the things that we're really good at.
Yeah.
And actually we're quite special because we get to have really great strengths. And the more aware and accepting we are of the things we find challenging, the easier things will be. But I totally hear what you're saying about the challenges of getting assessed for something that's bigger than it is for other conditions. And I know I found that I spoke to my doctor and she was great, but she said basically I probably won't put you forward for an assessment because you're just about managing in life. And then she wrote to me and said, I will, but you have to write a list of all the things you struggle with. And as someone who's potentially has ADHD, the thought of sitting down and writing a list is really hard.
It's an absolutely.
I feel like it was like a trick question because I'm like, that's quite a boring thing to do. It's not urgent, so I probably won't get around to it. Hopefully will eventually, but it just made me laugh a bit that she asked me to do something that I found really hard.
Absolutely. And it's funny you say that. I've just picked up a new client who has ADHD. She's running her own consultancy and coaching business. She and her partner run a couple of shops, and she has all the frustrating challenges that go with ADHD. She can write a project plan for a multi-million-pound project, but she's being fined because she hasn't paid parking tickets on time. Yeah. You and I have talked about this. She's been to her GP, who has said, I think you're absolutely right. From everything you're telling me, you have ADHD, but I can't refer you for a formal diagnosis because you're not suicidal and you're coping. Yeah. You know, your kids aren't on the verge of being taken into care. And you think, and that's why I get so cross about this mental health avenue, because if that was somebody with dyslexia, yeah, it would be enough to get the support. So unfortunately, going down a National Health Service route is long, it's painful, and you'd actually have to be a lot less functional than most women with ADHD are to
because
qualify.
We're good at functioning, or we're good at
appearing
like we're functioning. Precisely. We're good at what's the word?
Are you thinking masking?
Compensating.
Yeah, compensating, strategizing.
Yes. But I hope, and I know this would be your heart too, so I hope if you're listening to this and feeling a bit hopeless or worried about that you can also be reassured there are so many great resources out there. Like Sue's saying, there's some really great places you can start with looking at the websites you've recommended, and we will pop the link to them in the bio. And be encouraged, there's a community out there. I love following other people on Instagram, like other ADHD accounts, and just knowing that you're not alone, even though you're unique and special, you're not alone in this journey. And something we could probably have a whole other podcast about. Absolutely. Is that there's other things to explore, like lifestyle.
Of us, we think, Jo, it's about 20% of us are neurodivergent in one way or another, and it's starting to be seen as an evolutionary advantage. That's the way that the sector are coming at it and saying humanity has these different ways of thinking, because you need those different styles of thinking for humanity to work as a society. And just going back to what you were saying about living well, there are no magic answers for this, but first of all, if you feel that this is you, trust your own judgment do some finding out, do something to back yourself up, and then be kind to yourself and say, well, you know, if I'm not good at this, is this good use of my time? You don't even have to put a label on it. Is this a good use of my time if I'm not good at it? Would I be better to use somebody else's time for that? And all the things that we talk about in terms of ordinary well-being, sleeping well, resting, eating well, they all help. Plenty of water, they all help. They all help enormously. There's some evidence that omega-3 supplements can be useful, particularly for ADHD, and it's something that's done with kids. Worst case scenario, we're all short of omega-3 anyway. It can't do you any harm.
Absolutely.
You might not notice any difference. You might find that your brain fog is a little bit better. That might be a placebo effect. If it works, who cares? But those things, I think the biggest thing is to say, believe in what you know about yourself. If you think you're noticing something about yourself, have confidence in your own judgment, be kind and curious about yourself in the way that you would be for a good friend. Do not use harsh language to yourself. Do not tell yourself you're stupid or you're lazy, because you're not. And there will be plenty of stuff in the rest of the world that will tell you that. It's not true.
Yeah,
I'm going to shut up there because I'll go on forever. You know me.
I wish you could. I wish we had time for you to. And thank you for reminding us to ask you what living life well means to you. This is my special, amazing, chaotic brain that forgets to do things in the right order. But I love that you brought it back to that. And I totally agree. I find lifestyle things super helpful to help me manage my brain and to live life as well as I can. So like you say, eating well, resting well, moving, exercise is great for me, supplements, all those things that will help all of us will help us, those of us who are neurodivergent, and that can only be a good thing. And just knowing that empowers you, you don't need to necessarily have a formal diagnosis or medication to be able to thrive. I love that you used that word thrive earlier. It's not just about surviving and getting through it. It's about accepting how you are fearfully and wonderfully made and finding ways to thrive in this crazy world we live in. So that's just been golden. I feel like we definitely need to get you back to dive into this more because there's so much we could talk about. But Sue, could you just tell us where to find you? Because I feel people will definitely want to ask you questions after this. And I know chats that I've had with you have been so helpful. So where can we find you?
You can find me on Facebook at Sue Murphy Coaching. I'm on LinkedIn. I do have a website, which my wonderful friend Roxy Rhodes is in the middle of redoing for me. But if you put Sue Murphy Coaching into Google, it will come up with my existing website. And I'm more than happy to be contacted for a chat. I'm in Wise Tribe, which is a group you and I both belong to. But yeah, if I can be found under Sue Murphy Coaching almost anywhere. LinkedIn and Facebook are the social media I use most. I'm not on Instagram and the others because I can't cope with that range of social media, frankly, and it's not where the people that I'm coaching will come from. Well, is that what you needed? Is that okay?
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, just so we know Sue Murphy Coaching, we know where to find you. That's amazing. Yeah. Please have a chat with Sue if it could be helpful. I know it would be. What was I going to say? But yeah, I just hope after our chat tonight that you feel encouraged, you feel hopeful, and I hope you feel like even if you don't feel like you are on that neurodivergent, what do we call it? What's
Spectrum.
the word? Spectrum is the word I'm looking for. Yeah. My brain. That you will probably know someone who is one of those 20%. So hopefully you feel empowered to support them and encourage them better. But I've loved chatting with you, Sue, so much, always. So Sue, just to finish off on a bit of a fun note, we would love to know if it's your last meal on earth, because we just love food. We love talking about food. What would you choose?
Last meal on earth. Well, I'm afraid my Yorkshire roots are going to show through. There would have to be roast beef, roast potatoes, lots of veg, and Yorkshire pudding involved. But there might be a smoked salmon starter, and then a homemade bakewell pudding to finish.
Sounds amazing.
None of that is particularly healthy, but it's absolutely.
It's your last meal. It doesn't matter, does it?
No, that's right. I don't have to worry, do I?
And it was Yorkshire Day this week, so it's fitting that you picked Yorkshire
Yeah.
puddings, which are obviously amazing. Oh, so it's been wonderful as always. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll have you back on soon. So thank you so much for sharing your heart and your wisdom with us tonight.
Oh, thanks for asking me, Joanne. It's lovely. It's always a joy to talk to you. So I'm very happy to come back anytime you want me.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Sue. We'll see you soon.
All
Thanks for
right,
listening,
take care.
everyone. Take care. Thank you so much for listening today. I really hope you've had some inspiration to look after yourself, body, mind, and soul, and feel as well as you deserve to do. Please remember to subscribe and share this podcast if it's been helpful for you. And I'll see you again soon with another episode and some more amazing guests. Take care.